Okay, well, thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining this sponsor webinar by Certara. So I am Eric Smith. I'm the Client Development Manager for Certara. We facilitate this sponsor webinar. So I hope you enjoy. I hope you enjoy the next hour or so. And I'll just hand you over to Suzanne, who will take you through the presentation and the webinar itself. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric, for the introduction, and thank you so much to Certara for their support. I'm Dr. Suzanne Minton. I'm a Director of Content Strategy at Certara. Just a brief disclaimer for everybody. While Certara is facilitating this webinar for Certara, it's not an endorsement of Certara, Certara's affiliates, employees, products, or services. Certara is not responsible for the content or views expressed during this webinar. Certara accelerates medicines using proprietary biosimulation software, technology, and services to transform traditional drug development and discovery. Our clients include more than 2,000 biopharmaceutical companies, academic institutions, and regulatory agencies across 62 countries. Today's presentation is Understanding Key Components of a Clinical Evaluation. Our speaker is Mrs. Angela Siebenek. Angela is currently a Director of Regulatory Strategy and Policy at Certara. She has over 30 years of clinical and regulatory experience, and she began her career as a registered nurse in a hospital setting. Angela has extensive expertise in regulatory strategy, clinical and medical writing, and she has authored or contributed to multiple regulatory submissions. Angela, welcome to today's webinar. I'll now turn it over to her to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Suzanne. Can you hear me okay?
You sound fantastic.
Great. So thank you for the introduction, and we're really thankful for Certara to have us here today to speak on understanding key components of clinical evaluation. As Suzanne mentioned, I work for Certara as the Director of Regulatory Strategy and Policy. And I've been with Certara for almost 2 years now, and I've worked in medical device since 2013. In addition to my role at Certara, I am a registered nurse still and have been since 1994. So that's how I got here today. Back in 2014, I had moved into the medical device world a year prior, and the company I was working for needed someone to take over clinical evaluation reports. My manager said, Angela's a nurse, she's clinical, so she can do it. So I figured it out, and I've been continuing to figure it out since then, and writing and reviewing clinical evaluations since that time. To make sure I have enough bandwidth, I am going to turn off my webcam and just show you the PowerPoint for now. So here we go. I have, over the years, Suzanne also mentioned, I've written or reviewed over 100 clinical evaluation reports. And during that time, I've run into so many different interpretations of what clinical evaluation is and how to complete it. So today, I want to go through some of those things that I've found essential for your clinical evaluation process as part of those EU submissions. When I started writing clinical evaluation reports, it was really kind of an afterthought by the engineer team. And I don't know if some of you are still in that predicament, but they were ready to launch their product in Europe and they needed a report. Back then, there was no prescribed schedule for updates, and anyone who had time would write them or update them. Since that time, as many of you are probably aware, clinical evaluation has become so much more than just a simple report. And it needs to be part of the design process to ensure you have sufficient clinical data. So in order to know what's expected, we first will go through the applicable guidance and regulations, and I promise I'll do that quickly, as I'm sure many of you know them. And we'll then move into the stages of clinical evaluation, the expected documentation, including the clinical evaluation plan, the clinical evaluation report, and that literature protocol and literature report. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a high-level overview of those clinical evaluation key components, each of which I could probably do a webinar on by themselves, but We'll start with how to perform a methodologically sound literature review. And then I'll move into what's state of the art, and then how we show equivalence now, and then the ominous sufficient clinical data, and how do we know if we have that, and then finish up with PMS and post-market clinical follow-up. So a lot to cover, but we'll get there. So what you need to know is in the guidance and regulations, but there's a lot of them. So, and interpreting them is not always the easiest. So in addition to the MDR, there are MDCG guidance documents and the IMDRF guidances, and also the MedDev guidance. So I'll kind of review those and where you can find those. I have to go back. I couldn't fit all the years on here, but we'll start with me doing CERs in 2014 was under MedDev 2.7/1 Rev 3, so that's not on here. That was the guidance I followed. It was about 30 pages long for those of you that remember, and it was pretty vague. So in 2014, I had authored 3 CERs, and in 2015, until the MedDev came out, the revision, I had done another 9. So when that update was released, it kind of changed what clinical evaluation was and turned the regulatory world kind of upside down, at least for me. So my 9 reports that I had done that year prior instantly became 23, and the reports almost doubled in length. So the team of me, myself, and I quickly, thankfully, became a team of 4 by the end of 2016. And we had not fully digested these changes and vetted our interpretation of what the MedDev update meant when the medical device regulation and the in vitro diagnostic regulations were released. There wasn't really a lot of additions to clinical evaluation with those, but they did solidify clinical evaluation requirements into the regulations. As part of the MDR and IVDR, the Medical Device Coordination Group was formed. And as mentioned, they have probably over 80 guidance documents, I think. I tried to count them all, but there was a lot. So we'll specifically touch on those 3 pertaining specifically to clinical evaluation. And those will be 2020-5, so that will be for your equivalence. And then clinical data requirements for legacy devices is in 2020-6. And finally, the clinical evaluation assessment report template. If you're not familiar with that, that's for notified bodies, but it's a great place to start for knowing what they're looking for, and that is 2020-13. And then lastly, although it came before that, we'll touch on the 2019 IMDRF publication on clinical evaluation when we discuss that pertaining to analyzing the literature. So I won't go into the IVDR and PERs specifically today, but wanted to touch on what the new transitional plan is, and also what we discussed for CERs. Most of it is pretty relevant for PERs. So that deadline for IVDR was extended last year, October 2021. The primary reason for that extension was really nobody was having to have the notified bodies review their PERs. So there was like 8% of all IVDs that needed notified body review at that time. So in order to get those other 92% and get enough notified bodies, they've extended that. 2025 is for those Class D devices, 2026 for C, and 2027 for A and B. And then you should already have that for your Class A non-steriles. That was May of 2022. So in addition to having all these new guidance documents, even the definition of clinical evaluation, which I'm sure many of you have looked at, has become more complex. In MedDev 3, it was really vague. It defined it as an assessment and analysis of clinical data pertaining to the medical device in order to verify the clinical safety and performance of that device. But with MedDev Rev 4, they added all these buzzwords, and methodologically sound. It has to be ongoing, and you not only need to collect data and feed it to them, but you got to appraise it and you have to analyze it. And I think that's where a lot of people miss the mark. And then they added that you have to have sufficient clinical evidence to confirm compliance with the relevant, it said essential requirements, but now we know under MDR that's our GSPRs. And then the medical device regulation came out, and Article 61 and Annex 14 talk about that. And they really say similar things, systematic, planned process, and they added that including clinical benefits to the definition. So I know it was 2016. I know we've had a lot happen since then, but really you need to go back to this MedDev update and look and see what is required in it, because even today I see people not following this. Some of those major changes really were you have to get your MedDev, or excuse me, get your CER updated annually for those class 3 and high risk devices, and then updates every 2 to 5 years for your class 2 and 2A and B that aren't implantables. And then that time frame for updates will have to be justified. So if you think you can just say mine is every 5 years, you need to explain why. And then if you haven't done those CERs for your class 1s and you haven't had that technical file audit yet, you need to get on that right away. Another area I've seen questions is regarding to the qualification of the authors and evaluators. And this should include someone who has a relevant degree with medical writing, regulatory and research methodology experience, as well as clinical experience or expertise in the medical specialty. So this is a rather high bar, and often a team of authors or evaluators can meet those qualifications. But I have seen questions from the notified bodies stating that the author who had a PhD in biological engineering was not a qualified author, and that a physician with a different specialty was not a qualified reviewer. So make sure you have all those boxes checked on your report. And then other areas that we're going to go into a little bit more in depth are state of the art and what that consists of, what is sufficient clinical data, and then post-market clinical follow-up. So the change to MDR and the MedDev Rev 4 and the MDCG guidance documents really changed what clinical evaluation process was, as well as the expected documentation. So let's move on to the process of clinical evaluation. In Rev 3, it did have stages. I thought it was just a pretty picture, but they were really talking about that this isn't just gathering a bunch of information together, putting it on your desk and writing a report. And in the Rev 4, they added a stage 0. So before you can even start those 4 stages, you need to scope what you're going to do. And really, scoping is your plan. So stage 1 then is where you're going to identify. And if we look back to that definition, we're identifying our clinical data, then we have to appraise it, and then we have to analyze it. And then finally, we can take all of that and put it into a report. If you need further information on that, that is in the MedDev section 11 and appendix 9 and 10. So the stages of clinical evaluation equate to deliverables. As mentioned, what used to be a report has now evolved into a clinical evaluation plan, a literature search protocol and report. And then I do one of those for each, both clinical data and state of the art. And those feed into finally the clinical evaluation report. And I have the PMS and PMCF on here as well, because they'll each have a plan as well as data. And then those reports become part of that clinical evaluation report. So the first stage, stage 0. Now we're scoping the clinical evaluation. In my experience, most are really doing a formal documented plan now, which is generally a separate document. And if you do it as a separate document, I suggest including that as an appendix to your report. So how do we do a documented plan? It's kind of ambiguous, but they've done some clarification. They've helped us out a little bit. They've given us MDCG 2020-13, which was that notified body checklist and what they should expect. And then also Annex 14, Part A, Section 1A, states that you should identify the general safety and performance requirements that you're gonna that are required for your clinical data. And then it needs to state the intended purpose of the device and identify the population. It should include the indications and contraindications and give a detailed description of intended clinical benefits for patients. The clinical safety data should be identified, as well as the residual risks and side effects. And it needs to have a description of what state-of-the-art is for the device. And finally, it should state the type of the clinical evaluation you're going to do. Excuse me, is this through clinical data or is it based on equivalence? And that can be found in Section 7 and Appendix 3, excuse me, of the MedDev Rev 4. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on literature. Literature is really an important component of how, if you don't have your own clinical data, how you can find additional clinical data. But the important thing about this is that it has to be methodologically sound and repeatable. So we'll go into what that protocol and review look like. This is also stage 1 and part of the stage 1. But before we can do our literature search, we have to have that protocol. That's kind of similar to your CEP. It may be a standalone document. Not always. Some people do include it as part of the report. And if they do, they put that right prior to that literature summary. So this will apply to both clinical data as well as state-of-the-art. The guidance says it has to be methodologically sound and repeatable. So, and believe me, the notified body has come in and taken my search criteria and they have tried to repeat it, and they want to see what your output was and make sure that you aren't cherry picking the data to show only the good. So in doing that, you need to make sure you include the background of the device, the name, the model, why you're doing this review, and any of the prior literature reviews. So, you know, if you have another report, make sure you include that information in this literature protocol and report as well. And then you want to state how this is going to feed back into your risk management process. And you should include all of those. If you're doing equivalence, you got to include your equivalent devices as well. So the protocol should also be objective and consistent with the scope of the clinical evaluation. And it needs to include the intended performance of the device, including those claims on performance and clinical safety. So additionally, you're going to put in there what all your methods are, your dates, your sources, any filters that you're going to use, your selection criteria, and your appraisal criteria, which I'll cover a little bit more. But you'll also want to include those databases, and those, the MedDev says Embase and PubMed, Cochrane, ScienceDirect, Google Scholar, but the MedDev recommends at least 2 databases. Now for state-of-the-art lit searches, you'll also want to include clinical practice guidelines and those applicable standards and consensus statements. So finally, you've got your protocol and you can get to your literature search. Well, not quite. So we have to get to that objective, non-biased, and systematic approach. The MedDev on page 38 gives you a list of examples of those different methods to come up with your research question. I generally use PICO because it seems the most applicable, generally speaking, because it's pretty straightforward. And it covers patient or population, and then what's your intervention, what are we going to compare that to, and what do we want to happen? And then you're going to take all of those terms and put them into a traditional or systematic lit review. Now, generally speaking, we're going to be doing that systematic lit review. But for some of our state-of-the-art, we need to do a little bit of a broader scope just to fill in our background. And so once we've established our protocol and that methodology, we're gonna do the traditional or the systematic review. Now the traditional lit review is broader in scope. It's great for, it's not looking for supporting evidence. It has those ad hoc searches. It's really not comprehensive. So I guess an example of that would be just like searching, central venous catheters. It doesn't really give you a whole lot of guidance on that. It doesn't give you inclusion or exclusion criteria and those filters, for example. But it would give you a nice background for central venous catheters first existed back in 1960 kind of thing. So generally speaking, for your clinical data, though, you're going to want to do that systematic lit review. And as I said, this is from Brown Library. I have the reference on the bottom. But that's going to be your well-defined question. You can use that PICO, and then that's going to help you find all the published and unpublished literature, which isn't always easy to find, but some of the databases do include stuff that hasn't been unpublished, and we'll have like conference abstracts and so forth in it. You'll make sure you have all your inclusion exclusion criteria, and you'll have your conclusions based on the study quality. So how do we do that? After the search question and the terms have been identified in the protocol, then the next step is really to implement your search, but you have to practice a little bit with that Boolean logic so that you get the appropriate filters. And as mentioned, those could be your dates, your types of studies. I usually put English and human in there. And then you want to export your search. So as soon as you've put those words in, you get your search. Now you need to export it because they're going to want to see every article that search pulled. And then from there, you have it, generally I put it in a table format, and then I put why I'm including or excluding every single article. So first time I'll go through that by titles and citations and abstracts, just to see if it's suitable, to see if they have safety and performance data, because that's really what we're looking for. And then we'll look and see if it's relevant. And if it is relevant, then I pull the full text publication and I appraise it for accepting or rejecting. So stage 2, remember, was appraisal. So this one is from the IMDRF, that 2019 document that I mentioned. And I use this in the next chart to decide if the article is the appropriate device, is it the appropriate application, if I'm doing pediatrics, does it include pediatrics? And then does it contain sufficient information? So from there, I know it's a little confusing. It says like D1, A1. As part of that, I might have, if it's 6 or less, I'd add those up, that it would be included automatically, or if it was appropriate device. So you'll have to come up with acceptability from this. They don't tell you, it needs to be a D1, A1, P1 in that report. So after we've decided it's suitable, then we need to look at the source of the data. So is this a good study? Is it appropriate? Do they have statistical significance? And is it something that really contributes to the clinical data on your device? So finally, after you've done that, we can start moving into the clinical evaluation report. You're going to want to summarize the literature that you have, put that in a report, and then we're going to take all of that and proceed to stage 4. So the clinical evaluation report needs to rely on review and input from a lot of other documents. It doesn't stand on its own. You have to look at those things that we already discussed, including the clinical evaluation plan, that literature search protocol, and that report. And additionally, we're going to have to review the technical file. So if this is being done in conjunction with the technical file, we're going to have to at least have a draft of that. We're going to need the information that would, or the information that would construct the technical file. Some of that information is you know, the manufacturing sites, those GSPRs, maybe some drawings and figures. And then another thing you're going to need is your instructions for use. So if that's not finalized yet, you need to get that finalized as well. You need to know what those indications are. You know, everything comes down to the indications. And then the contraindications and any complications. Those should all be listed in your IFU, but we have to look at them and how they compare to everything else, including our risk assessment document as part of this CER. So that risk assessment report will be reviewed and identified what risks are remaining. And then we kind of go back to that lit search too, right? So that literature search is going to have identified some risks. Are they the same as the risk assessment report? And then also we have that PMS report. So it's kind of a balancing act. You know, we look at our risks, we have to look at the risks in the risk assessment, look at the risks in the IFU, look at the risks we've identified in PMS, and come up with that the benefits for your device outweigh those risks. And then finally, especially if this is your first one, you'll take those findings of the clinical evaluation report and you'll come up with your PMCF plan. If it's not your first report, you should hopefully have a PMCF report that is feeding into your clinical evaluation report, and you're going to present those findings. So I know this seems mundane, but any manufacturer I go to seems to have a different template for their CER, and sometimes that's missing components of the CER, and you can lead to non-compliance. So this CER, you have to remember, is kind of like a puzzle, and each section is a piece of that puzzle, and they all have to fit together. So if you're missing one of these key contents that the MedDev Rev 4 Section 11 and Appendix 9 and 10 identify, then you're going to have a piece that you're not going to have a complete puzzle. So ensure you've clearly identified that each of these sections exists. You've cross-referenced them. You've appropriately tagged them in any tables or whatnot, so that the notified body can find them. Because this really is the #1 place that questions come. I can't tell you, it's guaranteed that every time the notified body will come back with a question saying, what is such and such? And that what is, I always go, well, it's right there. It was in, page 65, line 3, table 4, whatever. But they couldn't find it, or there was so much information there that they weren't able to identify it. So make sure that everything is written properly and easily found. So so we're going to start with our executive summary. Suzanne and I were talking the other day, and she said, you know, make sure you tell them what you're going to tell them again, and then tell them what you told them. And that's really what we're doing in this clinical evaluation, right? We have the executive summary. We're going to tell you what everything is. We're going to talk about the scope, and the scope is everything that's going to be in our report. And then we're going to tell you what it is, and that's our device, our background, our state of the art. And then we're going to show you our clinical data, and then we're going to appraise the clinical data, and we're going to show you our PMS. And each of those we're going to summarize, which we told you already in the executive summary. And now we're going to tell you one more time in the conclusions. So equivalence. Equivalence is one of those big sections of the CER. It's not in those table of contents, but it really, if you don't have sufficient clinical data, you're relying on equivalence. But equivalence is not the same in Europe, as many of you probably know, as it is in the US. In the US, we can use Joe Schmo, our competitor's device, as a predicate device. And historically, we used to be able to do that for Europe as well. But with the MedDev Rev 4, they said we have to have a single device. We have to have access to that technical information. Now, I have seen a manufacturer for a Class 2A product that did some reverse engineering and created technical information on a product and was approved through equivalence. I think that is not the norm, so I would not rely on that. So in general, access to the technical information means you have the technical file, and which means you're probably the owner of the device, because usually your competitors won't give that to you. You have to show clinical equivalence, so that really means the same indication, intended purpose, and body site with similar population and performance. So same is same, and similar can have some variance, right? And that means, and this is kind of a hard one for our engineer people to understand sometimes, but if I have a device that I'm putting in the arm and I want to put it in the vein in the neck, it can't be my equivalent device because it's not the same body site. And clinically, to the patient, that has a lot of different implications. You know, it's a larger vessel, it's more central, you know, all kinds of things that could cause more complications. So really remember that when you're doing your clinical part, and then your technical and biological. The technical has to have similar design conditions. You can have similar flow rates, pressure settings, and tensile strength. Those don't have to be the same. Because a lot of times I'm looking at this and I'm going, well, you know, if all this stuff has to be the same, isn't the same device, and that can be our hurdle, right? How much different are we doing? So it's usually also that, you know, we're just improving the same device and we're adding like a higher flow rate, or you know, higher tensile strength or something like that. Because even that biological needs to have the same materials and contacting the same tissue or body fluids. And then anything that isn't the same, or even if it's similar, you need to kind of justify why. And so I put this in a table format, put them side by side, show what's different, and explain those differences. Another key area is state of the art. Establishing state of the art is a large component of clinical evaluation to show why your device exists, and that it's at least as good as the alternatives. Because if you're not as good, then why are you there? And in Rev 3 of that MedDev, it was only mentioned 3 times. So it was kind of just this buzzword that we had. But in Rev 4, it's mentioned 39 times. So it's definitely a much larger focus. So to establish state of the art, we're going to talk about the historical knowledge of our device. what was before it, what other devices similar came to bring us to where we were. So if your device is iteration 17, then you'll want to talk about maybe not all 17, but how you got from 1 to 17. And what was the need for it? So what was the medical condition that, so that's part of your background, right? What's the background of your disease state or condition that requires the device? This doesn't have to be a book, but it really needs to show why the medical condition needs this device. So now the reason why I brought up equivalence first is because it's kind of a bummer that we can't use our competitors' devices as equivalents, but we can and we need to show those devices in the similar device section. We want to call out all of our competitors' devices that and what their risks are, what their benefits are, what their clinical data is, to show that we're in line with that or we're better than that. And that's part of those available alternatives possibly, but maybe not. So available alternatives, for example, I always go back to PICC lines because that's kind of where I first got into this business. But CR Bard's PICC line and Teleflex's PICC line, those are the similar devices. Now alternatives would be centrally inserted catheter and intravenous IV, peripheral IV. Or it could just be no treatment at all. So all of those things, we want to go through what those benefits and risks are and the associated treatment options so that we show why we're the same or we're better, right? So now that you've established you get to be here, you get to play in the game, now you need to prove that you have enough data for your device. So understanding sufficient clinical data can be an obstacle. Now this MDCG 2020-6 came out. It is for legacy devices, but it does kind of give us a hierarchy of clinical evidence, and it's a good roadmap for how to progress. So in this, it states that clinical investigations shall, and remember shall always means will, be performed for class 3 and implantable devices, even for our legacy devices. They do have some distinct exceptions from this requirements, and those are identified in Article 61.4, 5, and 6. But the sufficient clinical evidence is understood as a result of a qualified assessment. So really what this means is we're going to look at all of the data. We're going to look at how high on this hierarchy it is. And then a qualified person is going to assess if it's sufficient. And you're going to state that. In other words, we're going to analyze and summarize that in our report. Okay, so of course, our top hierarchy here, they didn't have it displayed this way, this is my rendition, but is your clinical investigation is like the highest tier, right? And then we go to the clinical investigations with gaps. And then the next one is registry data. And that doesn't just mean, the registry of orthopedic devices that is in one place. There are registries that are done by like hospital networks that you can purchase information from. So that's always an option. And then number 4 on there would be studies with flaws. So maybe you didn't have enough, you don't have statistical significance, or maybe there was an error in how you came up with your protocol for your clinical investigation. But even with those legacy devices, we need to have evidence in those top 4. So if you don't, you're probably going to have a question about it. And it doesn't always necessarily mean that it's your clinical study, right? It could be someone else's clinical study. Maybe it was a really well done clinical investigation on your device that you found in the literature. As long as you can get enough data on that, that might be enough. So then for the well-established technology, let's kind of think of that as our class 1, 2A, 2Bs that aren't implantable. From there, we can use additional sources, and we get down to that equivalence data that we were discussing, the state-of-the-art area. That's where our PMS data is. That's where our PMCF data could be, such as surveys, and then case reports. And then way at the bottom, still data is those common specifications, simulated use, animal cadaver, and then those preclinical and benchtop data. So really one of the things that I wanted to point out on this is, again, this is a judgment call, and this is by looking at pieces of the puzzle. You know, you're generally, if you did a clinical investigation, you're generally going to have preclinical benchtop data. You might have some simulated use in animal and cadaver data, and you might have common specifications. If you've already been launched in another geography, you might have that complaint data. You should have state-of-the-art information, right? And then if this was somewhere else and you have any surveys, you could include those too. So all of that is going to be combined to paint the picture of that sufficient clinical data. So we've done this clinical investigation, which showed this, as well as our complaint data showed this, as well as our preclinical data. So really, it's not one and done. It's building the story together. So PMS, post-market surveillance, has been around. That was kind of the mainstay. We relied on it. So I won't go into this a lot, but we do want to present our complaint data, at least since the last report. If it's your first report, you want to do all of the data, and you don't want to just give the numbers. You have to give the numbers, you have to analyze the numbers, and you have to explain the numbers. And you want to explain those numbers in reference to your risk assessment reports, right? Are they in line? Is that what you expected? And then you've got to disclose all these other things too, right? Your corrective and preventative actions, field actions. You should search any public databases, which I'll kind of quickly touch on. And then anything that was recalled. If something was recalled, you got to put it out there. You don't want the notified body coming to you and saying, you know, we found out, which I've been in this situation, that you didn't just, you know, they had an old information, which is why we need to do this often and keep it updated. But they had old information and they said you didn't talk about 2 deaths that happened. Oops. So make sure you talked about 2 deaths, make sure you talked about why you recalled the device, and then why it's back out there as well. So when we're painting the story, we don't have to just focus on the negative. We focus on the we show them what it is, and then we explain to them why it's okay. So finally, on the PMS forefront, right, we have a lot of different databases. No, you don't search the UTMed yet because we don't have it yet, but as soon as it exists, we will definitely search UTMed. You will search the databases for equivalent devices as well. So if you're claiming equivalence or there's similar devices in the market, you'll want to show you know, how your complaints are similar in those databases, and if they're not, if they're worse or better, then you'll explain those as well. So, you know, some of these, you don't report on all of them, you only report on where you're selling. So FDA has MOD, it should be capitalized, sorry, and then Europe, UTMed someday, we hope, Australia has TGA, Switzerland has Swissmedic, and then there's BFarm, Health Canada, and Australia has the Ministry of Health. So again, make sure that you're searching not only for your device, but any similar or equivalent products as well. So finally, last but definitely not least is post-market clinical follow-up. Post-market clinical follow-up is part of your post-market surveillance. And if you don't do it, you need to justify why you don't need it. And just because you think so isn't justification. But it's a continuous process. It is used to update the clinical evaluation. And the definition is a proactive collection and evaluation of data on clinical performance to confirm its scientific validity and ensure the continued suitability. That's from Annex 12 and Article 56. So some keys on that, it's proactive. So we have to be looking ahead. So you need that PMCF plan like we discussed. And it should be talked about in your PMS plan as well. And there's different ways we can do PMCF I've kind of got them backwards on there, but the one, you know, we don't want to have to do a clinical study on everybody, right? So we don't want to have to be forced to do PMCF studies on everyone, but that is definitely one of the things we could do. We can go back to that registry information that I talked about and evaluate that. And that is also clinical data, right? You could do a proactive lit search. I still have some of those popping into my email every so often from legacy projects that I've worked on. You know, I have alerts set with PubMed, and so it will send me, actually, I think that's with Embase. It sends me any new articles on the devices I had searched. And then kind of the one I'm seeing a lot of is clinical experience and feedback. And so it's not easy to do, but surveys are definitely out there. And I recently had a question of how many surveys you need to do. And I think that depends on what you're looking for and what you're trying to show. So if you do 25 and one person says it, you know, it didn't meet the criteria it was expecting, is that sufficient? It might be if you're really, you know, depending on what you're looking for. So again, that's going to be looking at the risk of the device and kind of the overall picture that you've painted. I will tell you also before I move on to this that I have yet to see a notified body say that was fabulous PMCF and you don't need to do it ever again. So just plan on it. You're going to need to do something. So to conclude, clinical evaluation is a process. It relies on knowing your guidance documents. And so if you haven't reviewed them, review them again. MedDev 2.7/1 Rev 4, those MDCGs, 2025, 6, and 13. And of course, MDR Article 61 and Annex 14. And make sure that you have qualified authors and evaluators because they will ask for your CVs. It's part of the clinical evaluation process, as well as your conflict of interest. So, you know, if the person doing this evaluation is likely to get, you know, stock options, you have to disclose that, and they might not think they're the best evaluator. So you need to ensure you've completed all stages of that clinical evaluation, including the scoping, the identification of the clinical data, and the appraisal of that data, and that you've analyzed it. Again, you can't just throw up all the data on them. You need to tell them what it means and put that in those required deliverables. You need to ensure that your device has been established as state-of-the-art through a solid background and disease review and identification of similar devices and alternative therapies, and that you show that your device is relevant and has a placement in the treatment of that disease. And if you're relying on equivalence, that you have that one device that is CE marked and you have access to the technical information, and that you've, again, you've told them what those differences are and what they mean and how they affect the safety and performance or don't of that device. And then finally, let's not forget that we've shown all of our forms of clinical data. We've summarized those and we've shown that they are sufficient. So thank you for your time. I believe we have a little bit of time left over to answer some questions now, if you think of those, and I will turn it over to, I will turn my camera back on here and have Suzanne back there. Hello.
All right. Hey, fantastic job, Angela. And it looks like, yeah, and it looks like we've got a lot of questions from the audience. I figure we'll try and answer as many as we can, and
sure.
If we run out of time, we can always respond by email.
Sure.
Fantastic. So someone says that their company struggles with demonstrating clinical benefits. What sources can be used to derive your medical device's clinical benefits?
So those would be, that's your clinical data. What does your device do for the patient? What's it intended to do, and is it doing those things? So you have to be careful with your clinical benefits, because that is kind of ties back into your claims. So what did you say in your intended use? And I understand that you might be struggling with it, but you have to be able to show that. You have to be able to prove it. And if you can't prove it, then you can't use that as a benefit. So the literature, of course, oftentimes they'll talk about, you know, how well a patient did with this, and the favorable outcomes were 3 times this or 5 times that. And then, you know, kind of doing the reverse of that, right? That, you know, we were able to put this device in this patient, and only 1% of the time did it break or cause any, you know, so you're always just going to say it did what it was supposed to do and rarely did what we don't want it to do.
Great. Someone wants to know, what's your process for determining if clinical data is needed? For example, if a device is a low risk, lower class device in which the risks can be mitigated using non-clinical data.
So that would be at the bottom of that pyramid. So, you know, you kind of have to use your judgment, and that's where, you know, sufficient clinical data is the determination of somebody with a clinical background. So if we're talking about a Band-Aid, you know, what are the risks with a Band-Aid, the adhesive, whatever. Can I show that in benchmark testing? Can I show what those risks are just through that form of data? So if you can't, then you have to have more. And so that's where we start going up that pyramid. And you know, if you can mitigate those risks and show they're mitigated, you know, by the common specifications, then that's what you claim. So it's all really about knowing what you have and being sure and stating that that's enough in all of these things. So we can't just say, here's the data, and you figure it out to see if there's enough, because the notified bodies don't know that. So that's where we have those clinical experts to determine that and say that, you know, the common specifications and the benchtop testing showed no reaction to that adhesive, so therefore it's safe and effective and functions as we said it was going to.
Makes sense. What grade would you give for a similar device when using the appraisal criteria for data suitability?
What grade? I think that equivalence was like number 6 on that pyramid or something like that. I think that's what you're asking. And so for your class 3 devices, that's probably not sufficient on its own. Now, with that said, you're showing equivalence to something that exists, but then you can add to it by showing their clinical data. So if they've done a clinical investigation and you have access to that from the literature, then you bump up from that level 6 a little bit, right? So we've shown that we're equivalent down here, but since we've proven that, but there is data up here. So that data can kind of bring you up to that one. So sometimes that will be enough. If it's a legacy device, you have equivalence and you have data. But, you know, I can never say yes or no on anything because all of it is, I mean, I can if I'm looking at all of the information you have, but then you would need to look at what is your benchtop testing. You know, have you done head-to-head testing with that equivalent device to show that you have the same strength, the same tensile strength, the same, you know, power injection, those kind of things. So your benchtop testing would add into that as well.
Great. Someone wants you to talk a little bit about your experience in compiling clinical evaluation reports for legacy medical devices.
Yeah, so legacy medical devices, that's just basically something that I'm just going to update a CER to MDR compliance based on, you know, it's been there. Generally, that means you've gotten 2 or 3 reports already done, and unless it was a class 1 device, you really should have an existing CER. And so really what I would do is I would go through all of the things that I never went through and stated before. Make sure you've included that benchtop testing. If there's any common specifications, you want to pull those out, and you want to take, you know, I will tell you that historically people just kind of threw up all the information and they didn't compile it and tell you what it means. And so from there you need to say, you know, our product's been around for 20 years. We have 20 years of data. We've only we've had 1% breakages, which is consistent with our risk assessment. And the clinical studies show that, or the literature shows that 1% is normal. And so therefore, we want to continue selling our device. Now, if it's that class 3, you would need to say, and we're going to continue to monitor this through post-market clinical follow-up. I really would not try, even with a legacy device that's been around 20 years, to not do post-market clinical follow-up, because I had been there initially, right? We keep learning. And the notified body said, you know, we said, we don't need to do it. We've been around for 20 years. And they said, great, what's your post-market clinical follow-up? And then we said, okay, we'll do proactive literature search. And they said, no, great, what's your post-market clinical follow-up? So then we came up with surveys, and they did accept that. So you show everything you've done, you show where you're at today, and then you have to show what you're going to continue to do.
Got it. A question came in on whether you have any advice on discussing the differences to equivalent medical devices.
Well, so the key about equivalence and those differences is to show that those differences aren't going to affect your safety or performance. Like if you have, you know, it depends on what the differences are, right? So you're supposed to have the same body site. If it's not the same body site, maybe, you know, it was put in the leg always and now it's the arm. Maybe you can justify why the arm and the leg aren't that much different. Of course, if you're, or if you're going from a more risky to a less risky site. And then the same thing, so anything that says the same, it really wants it to be the same, and you might have a hard-pressed time proving it otherwise, such as materials. So if you're going from silicone to polyurethane, silicone is softer and more compliant in the body, but polyurethane is stronger, but then it can cause more thrombosis. So that's why they want it the same. So really what you're going to just do is you're going to state why it doesn't matter. So anything that's different, it either makes it better, and you have benchtop testing to show that. So you can pull in your other and your common specifications. You know, this is the new and improved. This is the way we do it now. That kind of thing.
Got it. How do you determine the level of evidence? For example, legacy, level of evidence 1 or 4 are accepted, and how do you determine the methodological quality of the different study types? For example, randomized control trials, meta-analysis, case control, et cetera. Do you have any advice on that?
Yeah, so there's, I didn't show that one in here, but there is a hierarchy of, which I've done in other presentations. You know, obviously meta-analysis is the highest. And so you might have that in your protocol, that, you know, randomized control studies next, and then we've got observational studies. And so there is a hierarchy. I can't remember where it was, but I do have that somewhere of going through clinical evidence and rating that. The one they had was really like everything you might have for your device, not just literature or clinical investigations. But obviously, you know, clinical investigations are the highest, observational studies are lower, and chart audits are below that, right? Because they're retrospective. So you basically always have to state how you're grading it, and then show why it's that. But if you can find a reference, I mean, it's pretty common in research to have that methodology of, you know, what is the highest level. A lot of the organizations will rate their standards that way as well. Like, this information came from a meta-analysis, or this one came from a randomized retrospective study or a proactive study or whatnot. So there's a lot of resources on that, and I would, you can always email me. I can see if I can find that specific one for you that I had, but I did a presentation on it years ago in a nursing conference, as well as creating your evidence. So maybe we'll do that one another time, huh, Suzanne?
Yeah, there you go. Well, we've got about a half a dozen more questions, but I think in the interest of time, let's answer this last one, and then maybe the extra ones we can respond by email. But it's fantastic to see so many great questions. Regarding a legacy device, one has level 4 study with flaws. Can clinical data of a lower hierarchy be used to support these clinical data of level 4?
Yes. I would generally say that yes, that's how I would do it. And I would, you know, so that's where I would pull in my PMS data. I would pull in my benchmark testing. I would pull in any common specifications and saying, you know, we have this study, it's a level 4, but, you know, it's a legacy device. It's been on the market for 15 years. And in that, our PMS data has shown this. And the reason why they have a trouble with the PMS data is because it's reactive. And so I'll quickly, so for your class 3 medical device, if it breaks in a patient and it's in their heart, you know, a surgeon and person could die. A surgeon's going to call you, a person could die. I mean, it's a big deal, right? But if an IV breaks as I'm taking it out of a package, it's a class 2A device. And I might, as a nurse, throw that away 15 times before I ever told anyone. And so the complaint data isn't going to be as accurate in those lower class devices because people just aren't going to report it. It's not as, it takes more time for them than to just go get a new one versus, you know, $300 or $1,000 device or $10,000 device, and somebody could have died or did die, right? So, and that's where honestly that evaluating, like having criteria for PMS data on a class 2 device versus a class 3 device, your thresholds would be different as well. So like 1% complaint rate of breaking in that class 3 device versus 0.001 in that class 2A device might be both safe and effective.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you so much, Angela, for an excellent presentation, and thank you to our audience. They asked really phenomenal questions. It's great to see such engagement. And I'd like to thank TOPRA for facilitating this event, and would just like to thank everybody for this engaging discussion. This concludes the webinar. Goodbye and have a great day.
Thanks, Suzanne. Thanks, Topra.
Yep, thanks. Bye, everyone.